The date is July 26, 1944. For the crew of a British de Havilland Mosquito flying at 30,000 feet, the sky was supposed to be a sanctuary. At this altitude and at their speed, the Mosquito was considered untouchable. It was the fastest aircraft in the Allied arsenal, a wooden wonder that could outrun almost anything the Luftwaffe could put into the air. Flight Lieutenant A.E. Wall was piloting his reconnaissance craft over Munich when he glanced at his rear-view mirror. He saw a small dark speck on the horizon. In the tactical reality of 1944, a speck at that distance usually meant a pilot had minutes to prepare, to dive, or to maneuver. But this speck was defying the laws of aerial combat. Within seconds, the distant dot had transformed into a terrifyingly distinct shape. It had no propellers, it had wings that swept backward like the blade of a scythe, and it was closing the gap at a speed that A.E. Wall's brain could barely process. Before the British pilot could even bank his aircraft, the intruder was upon him. There was no rhythmic thrum of a piston engine, no familiar roar of a Daimler-Benz V12. Instead, as the aircraft tore past, it emitted a high-pitched metallic shriek, a sound like the atmosphere itself was being unzipped by a giant serrated blade. Wall pushed his Mosquito to its absolute limit, redlining the engines, but the twin-engined Ghost behind him toys with him. It circled the Mosquito with effortless grace, moving at over 500 miles per hour, nearly 150 miles per hour faster than the fastest Allied plane. This was the combat debut of the Messerschmitt Me 262, and for the men in the air that day, it felt like a visitation from the future. Days later, over the cramped, vibrating fuselages of B-17 flying fortresses, the story was the same. American waist gunners, men trained to track targets moving at 300 miles per hour, found themselves staring at a silver blur that moved so fast they couldn't even swing their .50 caliber machine guns in time to track it. Their K-14 computing sites, the height of Allied fire control technology, were suddenly pieces of useless glass. The math of the war had changed. If you were an Allied airman in the summer of 1944, you lived by a set of predictable rules. You knew how far a fighter could turn, how fast it could climb, and how much lead you needed to hit it. The Me 262 didn't just break those rules, it deleted them. When the crews returned to their bases in England and Italy, their debriefings were filled with a sense of quiet, chilling disbelief. They spoke of flying stovepipes and gliders with engines. To many intelligence officers back at headquarters, these reports sounded like hallucinations born of high-altitude hypoxia or combat stress. They told the crews it was impossible. They insisted that no aircraft could sustain those speeds without vibrating to pieces. They claimed the pilots were seeing reflections of the sun or perhaps new experimental rockets. But the men who had been in the plexiglass nose of a bomber knew better. They had heard the whistle. They had seen the silver flash that ignored their defenses and disappeared into the clouds before a single trigger could be pulled. The invisible ghost was real, and for the first time since the start of the war, the Allied mastery of the skies felt fragile. They weren't just fighting a new plane, they were fighting a shadow that moved faster than the speed of thought. The psychological shock was absolute. For the Allied bomber crews, the sky had suddenly become a very lonely, very dangerous place, haunted by a machine that shouldn't have existed. The engineering behind the Messerschmitt Me 262 was not merely an evolution of flight, it was a violent departure from everything the world knew about mechanics. While Allied engineers were struggling to squeeze every last horsepower out of massive, complex piston engines, German scientists, led by Hans von Ohain and Anselm Franz, were looking toward the void. They abandoned the propeller entirely, focusing instead on the Jumo 004 turbojet. It was a temperamental masterpiece of metallurgy. Inside the engine, air was sucked in, compressed, mixed with fuel, and ignited, creating a continuous explosion that pushed the aircraft forward with over 1,900 pounds of thrust. But the engine was only half of the miracle. At the speeds the 262 was achieving, standard straight wings would have been torn apart by the buildup of air resistance. To solve this, the Germans utilized swept-back wings, a design that allowed the aircraft to slip through the air and delay the onset of supersonic shock waves. To an Allied pilot sitting behind a prop, this was alien technology, a machine that didn't just fly through the air, but seemed to slice through the very fabric of the sky. However, this technological supremacy came with a terrifying price for the pilots who flew it. The Jumo 004 engines were notoriously fragile. If a pilot jammed the throttle forward too quickly, the engines would literally flame out or catch fire, turning the world's most advanced fighter into a multi-ton glider in seconds. Yet, when the engines held, the tactics were devastating. The Luftwaffe formed specialized units like Jagdverband 44, known as the Squadron of Experts. These men didn't engage in traditional dogfights. They didn't need to. They used a tactic called the slash. They would dive from thousands of feet above the Allied bomber streams, hurtling through the formation at 500 miles per hour, and unleash a devastating volley from four 30mm Mk-108 cannons. A single hit from these pneumatic hammers was enough to tear the wing off a B-17. By the time the American escort fighters could even roll their planes to give chase, the Me-262 was already miles away, disappearing into the horizon before the smoke from the exploded bomber had even cleared. But the 262's greatest enemy wasn't the Allied planes in the air, it was the reality on the ground. By late 1944, the German industrial machine was being hammered into dust. While the jet was invincible at 30,000 feet, it was helpless during takeoff and landing. Allied pilots, realizing they couldn't catch the Swallow in a fair fight, began a tactic they called rat-catching. P-51 Mustangs and British Tempests would leak over German airfields, circling like hawks, waiting for the jets to slow down for their landing approach. In these moments, the Me-262 was a sitting duck, its engines unable to respond quickly enough to escape an ambush. Furthermore, Adolf Hitler's own interference crippled the project. He had insisted the Me-262 be built as a blitz bomber rather than a pure interceptor, delaying its mass production by months. It was the ultimate irony of the war. The Germans had built a machine from the future, but they were trapped in a present that was rapidly collapsing around them. The Me-262 proved that while you can break the laws of physics, you cannot break the laws of logistics. It remains a haunting what-if of history, a glimpse of a terrifying future that arrived just a few months too late to change the fate of the world.
While the Messerschmitt Me-262 was an apex predator at 30,000 feet, it possessed a fatal structural weakness that the Allies were quick to exploit. The jet was a marvel of speed, but it was also a prisoner of its own physics. Because the Jumo 004 engines required a long, slow spool-up time, the aircraft was agonizingly vulnerable during takeoff and landing. It was in these windows of transition, when the jet was low, slow, and heavy with fuel, that the invisible ghost became a target. Allied intelligence, through grueling reconnaissance and prisoner interrogations, identified the specific airfields where the jets were based, such as Rhein-Hopsten and Lechfeld. They realized that they didn't need to outfly the jet in the stratosphere, they simply had to wait for it to come home. The Allied response was a brutal and effective tactic known as rat-catching. P-51 Mustangs and British Hawker Tempests began patrolling the perimeters of German jet bases at high altitudes, loitering in the clouds like birds of prey. As soon as a Me-262 began its long, straight landing approach, a phase where the jet pilot was forced to keep his speed constant and his focus locked on the runway, the Allied fighters would dive. With gravity giving them the speed their propellers couldn't generate on their own, the Mustangs would scream down on the unsuspecting jets. In these moments, the Me-262's superior technology meant nothing. Its pilot couldn't jam the throttle forward to escape without risking an engine fire, and he couldn't maneuver at low altitude against the agile Allied scouts. The airfields became graveyards for Germany's most advanced hope, littered with the charred wreckage of jets that were destroyed before they could even retract their landing gear. By the spring of 1945, the whistle of death was falling silent. The Me-262 had arrived with a scream that terrified the world, but it ended with a whimper of fuel shortages and cratered runways. However, as the guns went quiet, a new battle began, the race for the technology itself. Operation Lusty and Operation Paperclip saw American and Soviet teams scouring captured airfields to seize every airframe, engine, and blueprint they could find. The swept-wing data and jet propulsion secrets of the Me-262 were loaded onto ships and sent to laboratories in the United States and the USSR. The invisible ghost didn't truly die in 1945, it was dissected. The legacy of that first high-pitched whistle over the Bavarian clouds lives on in every modern fighter jet patrolling the skies today. The F-86 Sabre, the MiG-15, and every subsequent supersonic interceptor can trace their DNA directly back to the desperate, brilliant engineering of the 262. It remains one of the most haunting paradoxes of military history. A weapon that was meant to secure a 1,000-year empire instead provided the blueprint for the air forces of its conquerors. The Allied bomber crews never forgot the sound of that silver flash, a sound that signaled the end of the age of propellers and the birth of a terrifying new era of warfare, where the sky was no longer a place for men, but for machines that could move faster than the speed of sound.